I appreciate the introduction and I appreciate the invitation to speak and the opportunity to share my passion for understanding intergenerational trauma with all of you, a topic that is deeply personal to me as a third generation Holocaust survivor and central to my academic work. I'm grateful that you're here and open to listening. This topic resonates not only with me, but with many people. It asks us to look at our parents, our grandparents, the people who raised us, and see not just their strengths, but their wounds. And through that, make sense of patterns that have shaped us as individuals and our families in ways that we may never have recognized before. Before I begin, let me share a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, where I still live today with my husband Thomas and our three grown children. In addition to my work in Holocaust education, I'm also a full-time real estate professional here in Omaha. I earned my bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Nebraska, Omaha in 1998, and in May of 2025, I completed my master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Gratz College. Today, as Jane mentioned, I am speaking to you as a third generation Holocaust survivor, which means very simply that I'm a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. In my case, all four of my grandparents were survivors, an extremely rare circumstance. There is no formal study that exists to quantify how rare that is, but based on the sheer odds of survival, estimates suggest that fewer than 1% of third generation survivors can make that claim. Not only am I a 3G, a third generation survivor, but I am also a second generation immigrant. My father was born in Montevideo, Uruguay, and came to the United States when he was 12. And my mother was born in a displaced persons camp in Landsberg, Germany. When she was 3 months old, her family came to the United States. Displaced persons, or DP camps, were refugee camps created after World War II for survivors who couldn't return home because their communities had been destroyed and their families murdered. Despite everything they had endured, survivors began rebuilding their lives in those camps. And by 1947, nearly 250,000 Jewish survivors were living in displaced persons camps across Germany, Austria, and Italy, waiting to immigrate. In the years after liberation, interestingly, more Jewish children were born in these camps than anywhere else in Europe, which was a powerful symbol of survival and renewal. My family story is one of unimaginable loss, but also extraordinary strength and resilience. It was my own experience growing up in that legacy that sparked my interest and ultimately led me to study intergenerational trauma. In Holocaust survivor families, it's not only the stories of survival that get passed down, but also the underlying emotions and unspoken trauma, the stories that are never told, the coping mechanisms, the emotional patterns, and the unanswered questions. It shows itself in instinct, in behavior, and in how we respond to fear, loss, anger, and love. Throughout this talk, I'll explain how trauma didn't just disappear when the Holocaust ended, it transformed. Before we get into the specifics, I want to share that we'll cover during our time together. We'll touch on the Holocaust itself, how trauma is defined, and how we categorize the survivor generations. This is a very large field of study, one that we could talk about for hours on end, so we'll only just scratch the surface, but it will lay a foundation. And along the way, I'll share parts of my thesis, my family story, and my own journey to becoming a Holocaust educator. Let's start by briefly discussing the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a systematic state sponsored campaign of persecution and murder orchestrated by Hitler and the Nazi regime that resulted in the death of 6 million Jews. Between 1933 and 1945, the population of Europe's Jews, once vibrant and thriving, was reduced to only one of every three Jews by the end of the war. The mass killing of European Jews was sophisticated, methodical, and merciless. Despite an ancient history of anti-Semitism, pogroms, exile, and persecution, nothing could have prepared the Jewish community for Hitler's final solution. Half of the world's Jewish population, mainly in Eastern Europe, was wiped out, and the rich culture of European Jewry was lost forever. Survivors of the Holocaust suffered unimaginable trauma, dehumanization, and loss, and faced the difficult task of coping, healing, and rebuilding their lives after liberation. The war in Europe officially ended in 1945, but for Holocaust survivors, it was just the beginning of mourning their devastating losses and dealing with the traumatic experiences, along with the struggle to reintegrate into society and rebuild their lives. I want to share a quote by Dina Wardi, an Israeli clinical psychologist, Holocaust scholar, and one of the early researchers on intergenerational trauma. Her words capture something that statistics and timelines cannot. After the liberation, the survivors left the extermination camps, the hideouts, and the forests and began to wander about. Most of them eventually reached the displaced persons camps that had been set up in various parts of Europe. Many of them hoped to find lost family members and began to search for them, to ask about them, and to anticipate their arrival. This expectation generally ended in bitter disillusionment. Of their entire extended family, they realized no one was left but themselves. Their dear ones had indeed perished, and they would never see them again. This disillusionment brought with it a sense of unbearable loneliness, which was soon accompanied by the realization that they had lost not only their families, but also their homeland. The knowledge that they would never return to their birthplace and that their homes and communities had been destroyed was no less harsh a blow than the loss of their families. Only psychic emptiness could continue to protect them from being flooded with feelings of loneliness that threatened their very existence. That is what survival looked like. Trauma, nearly 8 decades after the Holocaust's end, continues to leave its imprint on survivors and the generations that followed. Its long-term psychological effects are evident not only in survivors who experienced the persecution firsthand and in many of their descendants who were affected indirectly, but also collectively among the entire Jewish people, both inside and outside of Israel. In survivor families like mine, the Holocaust isn't just a chapter in a textbook, it's a presence that still shapes who we are even decades later. Before we get further into the details of intergenerational trauma, I want to define what I mean when I refer to the first, second, and third generation of survivors. Each generation experienced the Holocaust very differently, and that difference matters. At one time, oops. At one time, the answer about who was a survivor and who wasn't was controversial. There was a perceived hierarchy of survival with concentration camp survivors at the very top. They were seen as the real survivors. Those who survived ghettos, labor camps, fled, or were in hiding were often viewed as less legitimate or less traumatized. That's no longer the case. Researcher and clinical psychologist Natan Kellerman offers one of the most inclusive definitions of a Holocaust survivor. He describes a survivor as any persecuted Jew who lived under Nazi occupation, was threatened by the final solution, and managed to stay alive. That includes people with very different experiences, those confined to ghettos, those in labor camps or concentration camps, those who hid or lived under false identities, refugees forced to leave their families behind, and those who fought with partisans. It's a broad definition and an important one because it reminds us that survival took many forms. Holocaust survivors shared several defining experiences, even though each person's story was unique. They lived through constant fear, persecution, starvation, dehumanization, unimaginable loss, displacement, and a daily struggle to survive. And after liberation, many faced deep grief, serious health issues, and the overwhelming challenge of rebuilding their lives in a world that had no framework to comprehend what they had been through. Some chose silence to protect themselves or their families. Others eventually shared their stories through testimony and writing, though often many years after the war. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, PTSD, isolation, paranoia, and hypervigilance. Mistrust of the world was common, as were challenges with attachment, depression, night terrors, and flashbacks. Some coped through emotional numbing or disassociation. Others struggled to regulate their emotions or find healthy ways to cope. Each person carried it differently, but the weight of trauma was always there. Together, these patterns show how deeply the Holocaust lived on in the minds, bodies, and daily lives of survivors. The war may have ended, but for many survivors, it never truly did. So, what is a second generation survivor? Yad Vashem defines a second generation Holocaust survivor as a child born after World War II to parents who survived Nazi persecution during the Holocaust. Most were born between 1946 and 1956 during the first decade after the war. Over the past few decades, a newer definition has emerged, recognizing a younger group of second generation survivors because survivors who were children during the war didn't start families until much later, and their children were born in the 1960s and beyond. Survivor parents often viewed their children, the second generation, as both obligated and uniquely positioned to maintain the continuity of the Jewish people, to rebuild families that had been destroyed, and to fill the void left by the Holocaust. The second generation was expected to rebuild a broken family lineage while also creating a sense of connection to the people, places, and objects that had been lost. The second generation faced a dual challenge, supporting the future of the Jewish nation and symbolically restoring the past that had disappeared. For those reasons, the children of survivors were referred to as memorial candles. What experiences defined the second generation, and what psychological themes um, resulted from being raised by Holocaust survivors? Second generation survivors grew up in households shaped by loss, silence, and resilience. Many were raised under what has been called a conspiracy of silence, an unwritten rule that the traumatic past was not discussed, even as its presence was felt in daily life. As children, they frequently acted as emotional caregivers for their parents, absorbing unspoken pain and feeling a deep need to protect or honor them in their survival. Many inherited fear and anxiety indirectly, becoming more sensitive to danger, the emotions of others, and the idea that safety was never assured. Common psychological themes among the second generation include guilt for not having suffered enough, pressure to succeed and make their parents proud, a strong sense of duty to remember and share their family's story, and difficulty distinguishing their own identity from the trauma their parents carried. Ultimately, the second generation was defined by growing up in the shadow of their parents' trauma, inheriting both the weight of their pain and the resilience that helped them survive. And finally, what is a third generation survivor? A third generation survivor is the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor with at least one grandparent who lived in Nazi occupied Europe during World War II. The majority of research on the effects of Holocaust trauma has focused on survivors in the second generation, with the third generation only recently gaining more attention as a subject of study. What shaped the third generation as descendants of survivors, and what psychological themes developed from their connection to that legacy? The third generation grew up inheriting both the stories and the silences passed down from their survivor grandparents, often realizing at a young age that their family history contained a traumatic past that they never experienced themselves. They encountered Holocaust memories not just in their families, but also through school, media, and the community. Many developed especially close bonds with their grandparents who often shared more with them than with their own children. And as they grew older, many actively explored their family history to fill gaps, understand their identity, and see how the Holocaust influenced their family story. For many, the Holocaust became part of their personal identity rather than just historical facts, creating a sense of duty to keep the memory alive as the last generation with direct access to survivors. Their experience often involved balancing pride in their heritage with the emotional burden of inherited trauma. Common psychological themes include a strong search for identity and purpose, rooted in family history, deep empathy, and emotional sensitivity, heightened social awareness and moral responsibility, and a powerful desire to preserve memory and carry on their family legacy. Many also inherited anxiety and a heightened sensitivity to fear, loss, and instability, along with perfectionism, or a drive to honor their ancestors through achievement. A curiosity or a sense of urgency to understand family trauma is common, as is an emotional connection to events and people that they never personally experienced. For many, being a 3G means holding pride and grief while feeling a sense of responsibility to educate, to speak, and to advocate so their family stories continue to be heard. The grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are the last generation to interact, communicate, and engage directly with survivors, making them uniquely significant in Holocaust memory. Their position in the family system is distinct in other ways too. Elderly survivors often kept their traumatic memories hidden from their own children. The pain was too close, the silence was necessary, but many found it easier to open up to their grandchildren, sharing stories and experiences that they had never been able to speak about before. The third generation sometimes knew more than the second, not because they lived closer to the trauma, but because enough time had passed for the silence to finally break. Unlike the second generation, the third generation didn't typically grow up in an environment that was saturated with loss, guilt, shame, and fear. And by the time they came along, something had shifted. The silence that had defined so many survivor households had begun to lift, and grandparents did start to tell their stories. 3Gs also encountered the Holocaust publicly and culturally through school, through the media, Holocaust Commemoration Day, and through organized trips like March of the Living. They were the first generation to grow up with the Holocaust as both a family memory and a public one. Though intergenerational trauma from the Holocaust survivors to their grandchildren is possible, being further removed from the trauma, along with generational differences, enables the third generation to process and relate to it in ways that differ from the second generation. Research on the third generation is still limited, but scholarship emerging now suggests a shifting narrative. A 2023 study among the most recent to focus on the third generation found that while some negative familial trauma patterns have been repeated, newer findings show that the third generation may be demonstrating resilience and post-traumatic growth rather than heightened mental and emotional suffering. A 2012 study found similar results. The third generation was affected by their grandparents' Holocaust trauma, but the impact didn't always manifest itself as abnormal psychological or behavioral patterns. For many of the third generation, that impact promotes resilience and strength. It shows up as high achievement, greater empathy, and a deep sense of responsibility to, excuse me, to keep Holocaust memory alive. The third generation's connection to the Holocaust is often intentional, unlike many in the second generation who may have been raised in silence. The third generation frequently seeks out their family histories. They want to understand, they want to preserve what their grandparents lived through. One researcher found that a third generation grandchild's risk for trauma related difficulties depended on whether trauma existed on both sides of the family. The research showed that poorer psychosocial functioning, which is a clinical way of asking how well someone is doing emotionally, socially, and in their everyday life, emerged only when both parents were themselves children of Holocaust survivors. When trauma histories existed on both sides, vulnerability was increased. I know this firsthand because both of my parents are children of survivors, so basically I never stood a chance. Growing up with that weight on both sides made one thing clear. The more saturated the family system with trauma, the greater the impact on the next generation. Ultimately, the third generation shows both the lingering effects of trauma and genuine resilience. Some do experience effects of trauma, especially when both parents carry the trauma, but many also show that deep empathy, a strong sense of purpose, and a commitment to keeping memory alive. While my research in today's discussion, whoops, my research in today's discussion focuses primarily on the first three generations. A fourth generation is emerging. With it comes new questions about how this history will continue to move forward and shape families, one that researchers are only beginning to explore. So, what is a fourth generation survivor? They are the children of the third generation, the great grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. They're growing up in a world where there are almost no living witnesses left. And unlike their parents or grandparents, most will never personally know a survivor. And yet their identities will continue to be shaped by inherited memory, family stories, and cultural remembrance. Their connection to the Holocaust will come not through personal interaction, but through education, recorded testimony, and the preservation efforts of the generations before them. The fourth generation will carry this history forward in a way that no generation has had to before. Without living witnesses, the responsibility shifts entirely to memory, to testimony, and to all of us. Before we can fully understand intergenerational trauma, we need to understand trauma itself. A clear definition helps us recognize the kind of overwhelming, life-altering experience that can leave psychological and physiological effects and ultimately be passed down through generations. The American Psychological Association defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event. That includes accidents, crime, natural disasters, physical or emotional abuse, neglect, witnessing or experiencing violence, the death of a loved one, or war. Think about that list. For Holocaust survivors, it wasn't one of those things, it was all of them, often at the same time, repeated over many years. After a traumatic event, shock and denial are typical. Over time, reactions can include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms. Trauma can blur the line between past and present. A sight, a sound, or an ordinary moment can suddenly trigger feelings of helplessness and fear rooted in long past experiences. And suddenly the past is no longer the past. It is present, vivid, and immediate. Trauma overwhelms our psychological defenses and it takes on a life of its own in memory and causes persistent, unexpected distress that can be difficult to understand or explain even for the person experiencing it. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, defines a traumatic event as a non-ordinary human experience involving serious harm or threat to oneself, one's family, property, or community. Without question, the Holocaust meets every aspect of that definition. It is widely regarded as one of the most traumatic events in human history, and understanding that trauma is the foundation for understanding what happens when trauma doesn't end with the generation that lived it. So, what is intergenerational trauma? The concept of intergenerational trauma centers on the idea that the effects of trauma experienced by one generation can influence the psychological and emotional well-being of future generations, shaping their emotions, behavior, and sense of identity, even though they didn't live through the trauma themselves. So, how does intergenerational trauma actually manifest? Research shows that trauma and its effects can be passed down through multiple generations. After an individual experiences profound trauma, the emotional after effects can be absorbed by those closest to them, most often family members. In the context of the Holocaust, intergenerational trauma shows up in the emotional, relational, and behavioral patterns of descendants who never directly experienced it, but grew up within its shadow. It can present as anxiety, hypervigilance, or difficulty regulating emotions. It can show up in challenges with trust, vulnerability, and attachment. Within families, it shapes communication, parenting styles, and expressions of fear, guilt, and responsibility, often in environments where loss and survival were present, even when unspoken. But it doesn't only show up as damage. The transmission of Holocaust trauma has also been associated with resilience, empathy, high achievement, and a deep sense of moral responsibility to remember and bear witness. The legacy of trauma can carry both wounds and strengths across generations. Both can be true at the same time. Now that we have a better understanding of what intergenerational trauma is, how does it actually move between generations? Trauma travels through psychological, relational, and social pathways. The way survivors carried their trauma shaped how they expressed emotion, coped with stress, and formed attachments, and those patterns carried directly into their parenting and the emotional climate of the home. Children often internalize these patterns without ever realizing it. They adapted to a parent's anxiety, silence, or hypervigilance, developing coping strategies that mirrored the emotional environment that they grew up in. Trauma was transmitted as much through absence and silence as through anything that was ever said. In this way, trauma becomes embedded in relationships, in identity, and in the stories families tell about the past. A key concept here is transgenerational transmission. This refers to the tendency for parents to replicate the parenting styles they experienced in their own childhood, whether those patterns were helpful or harmful. These patterns are closely tied to the quality of attachment formed between parent and child, and they can significantly shape a child's emotional and relational development. In Holocaust survivor families, unresolved trauma, grief, and fear often shaped parenting in ways that showed up as overprotection, emotional distance, or unpredictability. Researchers have identified two main forms of transgenerational transmission. The first is direct transmission. This is when a trauma-related condition in the survivor, such as depression, anxiety, or paranoia, appears in a similar form in the child. The second is indirect transmission, and this is the more common of the two. This occurs when the survivor's trauma impairs their ability to parent, creating emotional deprivation in the child, not from the lack of love, but from a limited capacity to provide consistent emotional support. That distinction matters. The parent loved the child, but trauma has taken something from them, and that absence is what shaped the child in ways that neither of them could see or understand at the time. In direct transmission, children develop symptoms similar to those of their parents, which then affects their own parenting and emotional availability. And indirect transmission, the second generation may grow up with emotional deprivation, instability, or unresolved grief that shapes how they relate to their own children. And as a result, the third generation may not inherit the original trauma itself, but the patterns that formed in response to it. Anxiety, depression, emotional intensity, hypervigilance, perfectionism, emotional distance, or on the other side, strength, resilience, empathy, and a drive to make meaning of their family's history. In this way, the Holocaust can echo well beyond the first two generations, shaping identity, relationships, and emotional functioning in the grandchildren, even without direct exposure. One of the most important factors in the transmission of trauma is family communication or the lack of it. Children who grew up in families where trauma was silently present, with little or no discussion, were even more vulnerable to its effects. What was spoken, what was avoided, and what was never said all shaped how descendants understood their history, processed their emotions, and made sense of the trauma that came before them. Silence is not neutral. It carries its own message, and children are far more perceptive than we give them credit for. Before moving on, I want to briefly mention epigenetics, a concept gaining traction in this field. In the context of Holocaust trauma, epigenetics refers to the idea that extreme stress and deprivation could have altered how certain genes function, specifically those involved in stress response and emotional regulation. These changes didn't alter DNA itself, but may have affected how genes were turned on and off, potentially influencing the psychological and physical functioning of descendants. The evidence is still developing and it's not yet conclusive, but it raises an important question. Could trauma be written not just into our memories and our families, but into our biology itself? If the answer is yes, it would fundamentally change how we understand what it means to inherit trauma. Time and more research will tell. The Holocaust reminds us that trauma didn't end with liberation. It lives on in families, shaping how later generations understand themselves, their history, and their responsibility to remember. That is what my research set out to understand. And I'd like to share the focus of my master's thesis and some of its key findings. What I'm sharing is a very condensed version of a lengthy thesis that was based on dozens of sources. The title of my thesis is Intergenerational Trauma in Third Generation Holocaust Survivors, a comparative analysis of two Transcending Trauma Project interviews. My research focused on whether Holocaust trauma extends beyond survivors and into later generations, specifically the third, and how deeply it shapes the lives, identities, and experiences of descendants. For my research, I used two interviews from the Transcending Trauma Project, a research initiative conducted by the Council for Relationships in Philadelphia that collected in-depth interviews with Holocaust survivors and their children and grandchildren over several decades. It remains one of the most cited resources in the field, valued for examining not only the damage trauma leaves behind, but also how families adapt, find meaning, and demonstrate resilience across generations. I analyzed the two interviews for evidence of specific psychological and behavioral patterns, including religious practice, connection to Judaism, identification with Israel, commitment to memory preservation, and engagement with their family's Holocaust legacy. The subjects were Jacob, age 20, and Sarah, age 18. Both had two Jewish parents, lived in Pennsylvania, were the oldest children in their families, and each had two survivor grandparents. Jacob's parents were married, and Sarah's parents were divorced. Religion has shaped human history since ancient times, and for Jewish people, the Holocaust created profound theological challenges. How does one reconcile belief in a loving and merciful God with the horror of the Holocaust? Some argue it defies theological explanation entirely, while others see it as part of a divine plan, however incomprehensible. Within that landscape, Jacob and Sarah, both raised in Jewish households, developed very different relationships to faith, practice, and Jewish identity. I examine each participant's level of Jewish practice and religious commitment, as these reveal how inherited history shapes spiritual and cultural identity. Jacob participates in Judaism out of obligation. Sarah identifies as religious and actively engages in Jewish life. When asked whether the Holocaust influenced their Jewish identity, Sarah answered yes, explaining that her grandparents were remarkable for enduring the Holocaust and emerging as committed religious Jews. Jacob, on the other hand, feels that nothing in his life has been shaped by the Holocaust. Another key area of comparison is a connection to Israel, which often reflects both personal identity and the influence of family history on one's relationship to the Jewish homeland. The Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel spans more than 35 centuries, and regardless of religious affiliation, most Jews feel a deep sense of attachment to the land, its history, and its culture. Jacob has never visited Israel and has no desire to go. Sarah, in contrast, has visited many times since childhood, lived there for a year, and celebrated her bat mitzvah there. For Jacob, Israel feels distant, and for Sarah, it is central to who she is. Finally, I examined how each participant engages with Holocaust memory and family legacy and their sense of responsibility for preserving their family story. For survivor families, remembrance carries deep emotional significance. It can help identify intergenerational trauma, strengthen intergenerational connections, promote healing, and interrupt inherited cycles of pain. Jacob has very little interest in the Holocaust or his identity as a third generation survivor and doesn't believe it has had any meaningful impact on his life. Sarah, in contrast, holds a deep and intentional understanding of the Holocaust history and its role in shaping her family and fully embraces her identity as a third generation survivor. Growing up, Sarah had stronger familial relationships and healthier coping skills. Jacob grew up in an environment that didn't prioritize family legacy, and as a result, he showed more significant emotional and psychological obstacles and a less cohesive family life. Family cohesion, coping strategies, emotional communication, and engagement with family legacy each play a significant role in shaping psychological development in third generation survivors. Though both came from similar backgrounds, Jacob and Sarah demonstrated very different outcomes in all three areas examined: connection to Judaism, connection to Israel, and engagement with Holocaust memory and family legacy. Together, their stories confirm that the Holocaust impact didn't end with liberation and that its effects continue to reverberate across generations. But they also reveal something important. The transmission of trauma alone doesn't determine outcome. Family cohesion, communication, and engagement with legacy can mean the difference between disconnection and deep, purposeful identity. The third generation is not a monolith. Their experiences vary widely, and understanding what shapes those differences is essential both for Holocaust memory and for the broader study of intergenerational trauma. Now, I want to step away from the research for a moment and into something more personal, and that's my family's story and the journey that brought me here as a Holocaust speaker and educator. Long before I understood what the word Holocaust meant or knew how to pronounce the names of the places that shaped my family's past or point to them on a map, I somehow understood that I carried the weight of a history that I never lived. The weight of devastation and loss, the strength of survival, and the miracle of resilience weren't just stories that I inherited, they were the foundation of who I was. My childhood was filled with happiness, warmth, and love, but also with silence, trauma, unpredictability, and emotional extremes. Not silence from a lack of words, but from a lack of explanation and understanding. The kind of silence that comes from people carrying more than they are capable of talking about. The trauma and emotional extremes weren't absolute or all consuming. It didn't erase all of the good, but it was always there, living beneath it, surfacing in sudden, chaotic emotion without warning, in moments of love, fear, sadness, and anger that sometimes felt misplaced, in tempers that flared irrationally, and in the mistrust, anxiety, and paranoia of everyday life. Emotional regulation didn't come naturally in my family, and it often shaped how we connected. There were too many high highs and low lows, too much anger and tension, too much sadness, too much smothering, too much watching over, too much managing, and the shifts between each of those emotions could be sudden, unpredictable, and overwhelming. There was never a single moment when somebody sat me down and told me what happened to my grandparents, at least not that I can remember. Instead, the Holocaust existed in the background, always there, hovering quietly and shaping the way that we lived, the way we spoke or didn't, the way we held joy, and the way we learned to carry pain. My grandparents spoke with thick foreign accents that separated them from the world that I was desperately trying to belong to as an American child in Omaha, Nebraska. Sometimes they misunderstood the nuance in what we said or did. Their English grammar was off, or they would slip into speaking German, Yiddish, or Spanish in public, and I would feel temporarily mortified. While my friends had grandparents that they called grandma and grandpa, I called mine Oma and Opa, German for grandmother and grandfather, and Bubby, Yiddish for grandmother. Oddly, I called my maternal grandfather Grandpa, the one name that felt ordinary among all the others. I hated the difference as a child. I wanted to be like everybody else. Now I would give anything to call them those names one more time. They also had behaviors that I found strange and unsettling, but I couldn't understand why. My parents were foreigners too. None of it was ordinary, at least not to a child. I just wanted to blend in and be normal, whatever that meant. Instead, I knew that my family was different and that their past was haunted by something that they struggled to talk about that I didn't fully understand. Knowing what I know now, it feels shameful to admit that they sometimes embarrassed me, but at the time, it didn't. For a long time, I didn't know how to reconcile both worlds at once, balancing the life and family that I thought I wanted, free of anything I thought was abnormal, with the history that I came from. It would take me years to realize that the history I was trying to hide was the only reason that I was here. I was raised by two people who were raised by survivors, and the emotional tools they had were shaped by trauma long before I was born. And that shaped everything: how they expressed emotion, how they behaved, how they parented, how they viewed the world, and how they related to each other. They did the best they could with what they were given, but they were given was limited, and some of those limitations showed up directly in my childhood, mostly in ways relationships were modeled and emotions were handled. Trauma leaves its mark on how people love, trust, and cope. Giving love is very complicated when you were never fully taught how to give it or receive it. My parents divorced when I was 23. My Jewish identity was tied to my grandparents and to a sense that something unspoken ran through our heritage, our faith, and their histories. Being Jewish wasn't just about going to synagogue or observing the holidays. It was about belonging to something greater and more meaningful than myself, a story and a people that stretched back centuries, and a responsibility that I was only beginning to understand. My upbringing was Jewish in the traditional sense. We celebrated the holidays, attended synagogue, I went to Hebrew school, I had a bat mitzvah. My grandparents lived Jewish lives, and so did we. When you think about it, it's actually pretty remarkable. Judaism was the reason that they were persecuted and the reason that their families were murdered, and yet they held on to it. Their faith never wavered. They never let Hitler take their identities, their faith, or the foundation of who they were and where they came from. In the face of everything designed to strip them of who they were, they remained Jewish. They rebuilt Jewish homes, raised Jewish children, and passed a Jewish identity down to the next generation. Growing up, I was proud to be Jewish, but I also felt burdened by a history that I didn't always understand, and at times I did resent it. Why couldn't my family be like everyone else's? Why did my grandparents talk differently and act differently? And why did they carry a pain that sent them apart from every other grandparent that I saw at school events? Why were our holidays different? Why didn't we celebrate Christmas like all of my friends did? Why weren't my parents born here in the United States like everybody else's parents? And why did my family feel everything so deeply? As I grew older and I learned more about what my grandparents had been through and what they survived, I realized that their story wasn't something to hide, it was something to honor, and eventually it became something to share. I'm not sure, but I think the first time I consciously realized that my family history was tied to something monumental was in middle school. When the Holocaust was introduced in class, something clicked. This wasn't just history. For me, it was personal. It wasn't a chapter in a textbook, it was my family. Other students were learning about faceless victims and distant atrocities, and I was indirectly learning about my grandparents. That realization both terrified and fascinated me, and I became obsessed with reading, learning, and asking questions. I wanted to understand what had happened, why it happened, and how my family had managed to survive. I devoured everything that I could find, from biographies of Hitler to accounts of Auschwitz, from Oskar Schindler to Anne Frank. In middle and high school, whenever I could choose a paper topic, I chose the Holocaust. Most kids were writing about pop stars or current events, but I was writing about Hitler, about Auschwitz, about survival. I spoke about it too whenever I had the chance. I shared my family story, or at least the little bit that I knew at the time. I didn't realize it then, but I was already stepping into the role of an educator, trying to give history a voice before I even fully understood it myself. I didn't have the language for it yet, but the seeds were planted. And then there was the poem. I was 13 and in middle school when I wrote it. And at the time, I didn't think much of it, and I definitely didn't expect it to become something that would help to define me decades later. But here, now at 50 years old, speaking to audiences about my family and the Holocaust, I realized that that poem was more than an assignment or a creative outlet. It was a calling, and somehow at 13, I had already started answering it. The poem wasn't sophisticated. I wrote it as a 13-year-old trying to make sense of a history far too large for my adolescent mind to understand, but something in me knew that it mattered. I dedicated it to all four of my grandparents, survivors of the unimaginable. Their lives were both a miracle and a responsibility. A miracle that they survived at all, and a responsibility because survival. I came to understand carries an obligation to remember and to tell, and even then I think I understood that. I ended the poem with the words, "We must be the teachers." I didn't know then just how telling that line would be. Born in Gleiwitz, Germany, now part of Poland on August 11th, 1907, my grandfather Walter Tichauer was imprisoned in the Buchenwald concentration camp shortly after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Not long after, he was miraculously granted immigration papers to Montevideo, Uruguay, an act that saved his life. He left behind his parents, Joseph and Elfrida, and his two sisters, Marguerite and Edith, hoping that they would eventually join him. They never did. After the war, Walter searched for his family through the Red Cross, but was unsuccessful. None of them survived. We believe that they were all murdered in Auschwitz. My grandmother, Helena Tichauer, was born in Krakow, Poland on December 9th, 1922, to Karol and Karolina Schulkind. She was sent to the Krakow ghetto in 1941, then to the Plaszow concentration camp in 1942, followed by Auschwitz in 1944, and was finally liberated from Bergen-Belsen in May 1945. Her mother, Carolina, survived alongside her. After liberation, the two traveled first to Sweden and then to Uruguay. Her father, her brother, and countless members of her family were all murdered during the war. Walter and Helena met in Montevideo, where they married and had two sons, Fred and Carl. In 1963, after Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, political unrest spread across parts of Latin America, and the Tichauer family no longer felt safe in Uruguay. They had originally planned to move to Israel, but Helena's sister Lola, already living in Omaha, convinced them to stop for a visit. They came, they fell in love with the city, and they never left. My grandfather, Barish, known as Ben Mauer, was born on November 7th, 1906, in Kuzina, Poland, to Lipa and Malka in the region of Galicia. He endured the Ulanov and Czestochowa ghettos and later Dachau concentration camp, where he was liberated in April of 1945. He was married before the war and had a son. After that, the record goes silent. I know almost nothing of his story. His family was lost, their names and fates largely erased by history. And finally, my grandmother, Mina Mauer, born on July 7th, 1919, in Brzeziny, Poland, about 60 miles from Warsaw, to Idel and Rivka Milach. Mina had three brothers, Major, Eli, and Shevach, and two sisters, Rajla and Hana. Of all six children, only one other survived the Holocaust, her sister, Rajla, also known as Rose. Before the war, Mina had been married to another man and had a baby whose name I never learned. I don't know how they died, only that they did. Mina was imprisoned in the Lodz ghetto until 1944 when she was sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. On March 5th, 1945, as the war was nearing its end, she was transported to Dachau and then to Turkheim, a subcamp of Dachau, where she was liberated on April 27th, 1945. In the aftermath of the war, she met my grandfather, Ben Mauer, in Warsaw, and they were married in October of 1945. From Warsaw, they were transferred to the Hofgeismar displaced persons camp, where my aunts Esther and Rebecca were born, and then to the Landsberg DP camp, where my mother Martha was born. The Mauer family came to Omaha in 1950 with the help of the Federation for Jewish Services, as it was called then, in Omaha, Nebraska. Together, the histories of my four grandparents reflect the devastation of the Holocaust and the extraordinary strength required to rebuild a life afterward. Their story is where mine begins, and it leads me to the trip that changed my life. In September 2018, I traveled to Germany and Poland with my father Fred and my sister Randy. We went for two reasons: to try and learn what happened to our family during the Holocaust, and to stand in the places where history happened and to experience it in no way that a book can fully capture. That trip changed my life. It solidified what I had always known. I was meant to be the voice for my family's history and to teach others about the Holocaust. It didn't feel like a choice, it felt inevitable. My grandparents were gone, their voices were silent, and who else would speak if I didn't? When I returned home, I decided to go back to school, and in May of 2025, I graduated with a master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I dove deep into history, testimony, genealogy, and education. I didn't just want to know the history and my grandparents' stories, I wanted to tell them. I began giving presentations and speaking about my family and the Holocaust. And each time I speak, I share the poem I wrote at 13, not because it's perfect, but because it marks the beginning, because it reminds me and my audiences that becoming a witness and honoring remembrance can begin at any age or stage of life, and that even the youngest voices matter. I believe that every person who hears a Holocaust story, regardless of the generation, becomes a carrier of that history. You may not have lived it, you may not even be Jewish, but once you know what happened, you have a choice to keep it alive or let it fade. And I know my choice. I made it when I was 13. I hope that after today, it's clear that for the people affected, the Holocaust didn't just end in 1945. Its impact continues to reverberate across families, identities, and generations. Trauma was transmitted not only through lived experience, but through silence, survival strategies, and family dynamics. The second generation bore the weight of their parents' pain in profound and complicated ways. The third generation inherited the emotional patterns, the unanswered questions, and the legacy of resilience that followed. Trauma, like memory, isn't inherited in a single form. It's shaped by family dynamics, communication, culture, and personal interpretation. But what is also passed down and what is often overlooked is strength. Survivors didn't only endure the unimaginable, they rebuilt families, communities, and lives. Their children and their grandchildren carry not just the imprint of trauma, but a legacy of persistence, resilience, empathy, and responsibility. For me, this isn't just academic, it's personal. Being a third generation survivor is complicated. It's pride and grief, and it's an unspoken sense of responsibility. It's being connected to people that I've never met, but know through my research and the stories passed down to me. It's recognizing how my parents, as second generation survivors, carry the impact of their parents' trauma and how that shaped our family. It's feeling the loss of those who never came home and the incredible pain alongside the strength of those who did. I stand here because four of my grandparents survived what so many didn't, because my parents navigated the space between inherited pain and hope of what could be, and because I listened for the stories they struggled to tell and believed that understanding them was the first step toward healing. For me, becoming a Holocaust educator is both an honor and an obligation. It is a bridge between the past and the present, a way to ensure that memory is preserved not as a distant historical fact, but as a human experience, one that was lived and that we can learn from. And as we move further from the Holocaust and as fewer survivors remain, it will fall to the descendants and to all of us to carry not only the facts of history, but the emotional truth of what it meant to live through it. Intergenerational trauma reminds us that history doesn't disappear because time has passed. Memory didn't stop at liberation. Survival doesn't erase suffering, but it can be carried forward and reshaped into strength, compassion, and a refusal to let the story forgotten. What began as a source of childhood embarrassment has become my deepest purpose and my greatest passion. It begins with my grandparents. Honoring their memory and telling their story is at the heart of everything I do, but it doesn't end there. It's also about the survival and future of the Jewish people and about lessons for all of humanity. It's about refusing to let denial, distortion, and silence erase the truth, and it's about standing up to anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred, prejudice, and injustice whenever and wherever they appear. And so I will keep teaching and I will keep speaking and I will keep telling the stories of Walter, Helena, Ben, and Mina because their voices matter, because memory is the only thing that stands between their story and silence. We must be the teachers. Thank you very much for listening to me today, for caring, and for being part of the work of remembrance. This story now begins with all of us.